You were never supposed to hear this, not because it's a lie. But because it's the part of history people chose to hide. Everyone talks about slavery, but no one talks about what they did to the women. No names, no mercy, no way out. And the worst part, it didn't happen in secret. It happened in the open, while the world watched and stayed silent. The world didn't look broken. That was the first lie. Mornings came the way they always had. Soft light stretching across open land. Markets slowly coming to life. Voices rising in ordinary conversation. To anyone passing through, it felt normal. Peaceful even. But normal can be the most dangerous illusion of all. Because just beyond the noise of daily life, there were places people didn't talk about. Not because they didn't exist, but because acknowledging them would mean admitting something far worse. That this world functioned exactly as it was designed to. A system where some lives were lived freely and others were quietly erased. No announcements, no warnings, just a slow, deliberate silence. And inside that silence were the women. They weren't seen in the streets the way others were. They weren't spoken about in open conversation. Their stories didn't pass from one person to another. It was as if they existed just outside the edge of memory. Close enough to be known, but far enough to be ignored. Sometimes, if you paid attention, you could feel it. In the way certain doors were always kept shut. In the way conversations would suddenly stop when a question came too close to the truth. In the way people learned very early on what not to ask. Because questions had consequences. And silence was safer. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors when the truth is buried. Whispers of women taken from places no one could quite name. Stories that didn't fully form. Cut off before they could become real. People heard them. People understood what they meant. But understanding is not the same as action. And in this world, knowing something was wrong didn't mean you would stop it. It only meant you would learn how to live with it. So life continued, unaffected on the surface, unchallenged at its core. And somewhere within that quiet, controlled normalcy, a line existed, invisible, but absolute. On one side of that line were people with names, choices, and voices. On the other side were those who had already begun to lose all three. No one crossed that line by accident. And once you were on the other side, the world didn't come looking for you. That was the system. Not chaos, not disorder, but something far more unsettling. Control so complete, it no longer needed to hide. And the most disturbing part wasn't what it did. It was how easily it was accepted. How quickly people learned to look away. How naturally silence became part of everyday life. Because the truth is, this story didn't begin with chains. It began with something much quieter. A choice, a collective decision, to pretend nothing was wrong. It never began with a warning, no loud announcement, no time to prepare, just a moment that split everything into before and after. For many of them, it started like any other day. The air felt the same. The routines were familiar, small, ordinary movements that gave life its shape. A conversation, a task half finished, a glance towards someone who felt permanent. And then it was gone. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once. Voices replaced by shouting, confusion turning into fear before it could even be understood. Hands grabbing, pulling, separating. Not asking, never asking. There was no explanation given, because none was needed. The system didn't require understanding, only obedience. Some tried to hold on, to children, to mothers, to anything that felt like home. But that was the first thing taken. Connection, because it's easier to break someone when they have no one left to reach for. Names were called out, but not with care, not with recognition, only as a way to sort, to divide, to claim. And in that chaos, something invisible began to disappear. Identity, not all at once, but enough to be felt, enough to create a silence inside a person, even while the world around them was filled with noise. For the women, the fear carried something deeper, something unspoken, because they understood, even without words, that this was not just about being taken. It was about what came next, a knowing that settled in before the journey even began. Heavy, unavoidable, and impossible to escape. Some resisted. Of course they did. Anyone would. But resistance in a system like this didn't change the outcome. It only changed the cost, and the cost was always paid in pain. So eventually, the fighting stopped, not because they accepted it, but because they were forced to understand it. This was not an accident, not a moment of chaos, not a mistake that would be corrected. This was deliberate, organized, expected. By the time the movement began, by the time they were forced away from everything they had ever known, the truth had already settled in. No one was coming. No one was going to stop this. And the world they had lived in just moments before, the one that felt stable, predictable, safe, was already out of reach. What remained was uncertainty, fear, and the slow growing realization that they were no longer seen as people, only as something to be taken, something to be moved, something to be owned. And as the distance grew, step by step, mile by mile, the past didn't just feel far away. It felt erased. The journey didn't feel like movement. It felt like disappearance. By the time they were forced forward, there was no clear direction anymore. No sense of where they were going or how far they had already been taken. Only distance, only separation. The world they knew had already slipped beyond reach, and what lay ahead was something no one explained. They were kept close, too close. Bodies pressed together, movement restricted, watched at all times. Not as people being transported, but as something being delivered. Something that needed to arrive intact. Time began to lose its meaning. Days didn't feel like days. Nights didn't feel like rest. Everything blurred into a single endless stretch of exhaustion. Hunger wasn't a request. It was a constant. Thirst wasn't discomfort. It was control. Because when basic needs are controlled, so is everything else. And slowly, quietly, something began to change inside them. Not all at once, but enough to be felt. Voices grew quieter. Not because there was nothing to say, but because speaking no longer changed anything. Hope didn't disappear completely, but it became fragile, careful, hidden. Because in a place like this, even hope could feel dangerous. The women stayed close when they could, not by choice, but by instinct. A glance, a shift in posture, the smallest presence of another person who understood without words. It wasn't comfort, but it was something. And sometimes, something is all that keeps a person from breaking. But the system understood that too. Separation didn't end when the journey began. It continued, subtle at first, then absolute. Because isolation isn't just physical, it's psychological. And once a person feels alone enough, they stop believing anyone can hear them. That's when control becomes complete. No chains needed, no force required, just silence, doing its work. Some tried to remember. Faces, voices, moments that once felt permanent. But memory under pressure begins to fade. Not because it wants to, but because survival demands space. And eventually, the mind lets go of what it can't hold. By the time the journey neared its end, whatever that end was, they were no longer who they had been. Not fully, not completely. Something had been taken long before they arrived. Not just freedom, but certainty, identity, the quiet belief that their lives belonged to them. And as they were finally brought to a stop, as the movement ended and a new kind of stillness took its place, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not the end of what was happening. It was only the beginning. When the movement stopped, the silence didn't. It changed, became sharper, more controlled, as if everything that had been building was now being revealed piece by piece. They were brought into a place that didn't feel hidden. That was the first shock. This wasn't tucked away in darkness. It wasn't something carefully concealed. It existed in the open, structured, organized, expected. People moved through it with purpose, not confusion, not hesitation. Routine, that's what made it unsettling, because nothing here felt accidental. The women were separated again, more precisely this time, more deliberately. Each movement guided, watched, corrected, not as individuals, but as items being arranged, positioned, prepared. There were eyes everywhere, not the kind that see a person, but the kind that assess, measure, decide value. And in those moments, whatever remained of identity was pushed even further away. Names were no longer used. If they had been before, now there was no reason for them at all, because names imply something human, something personal, and here that had no place. They were made to stand, to turn, to remain still when told. Every action controlled, every reaction observed. Not a single movement belonged to them anymore. Voices surrounded them, calm, casual, discussing, as if nothing about this required urgency or emotion, as if what was happening was completely normal. And that was the most disturbing part. Not the control, not even the loss, but the ease, the way people participated without question, without pause, without acknowledgement of what they were truly seeing. Some looked away, briefly, just enough to avoid discomfort, but not enough to stop anything, because looking away is different from refusing. And this world had learned the difference well. For the women, the realization settled in fully now. This was not temporary, not a phase they would pass through. This was a transition into something else entirely, something permanent. They were no longer being taken somewhere. They had arrived, and what they had arrived as was no longer human in the eyes of the system, only something to be chosen, to be assigned, to be owned. Time didn't slow down. It didn't give space to process. Decisions were made quickly, final, without explanation, without consent. And once those decisions were made, there was no undoing them, no returning to what was before, no reclaiming what had been taken. Because here, everything had a direction, everything had a purpose, and none of it included freedom. As they were led away, one by one, into separate paths they didn't choose, one truth became impossible to escape. They hadn't just lost where they came from, they had lost who they were allowed to be. Time did not bring adjustment. It only brought repetition. Days began to lose distinction, when blending into the next without clear beginning or end. There were no markers anymore. No sense of passage that felt meaningful. Only tasks, only expectation, only silence that had to be maintained. The women were no longer seen as individuals. That was already decided. Now they were treated as functions, a presence that existed only in relation to work, instruction, and control. Speak only when spoken to, move only when allowed, stop when told. Even breathing began to feel monitored. At first there was resistance in small forms, a hesitation before obeying, a look that lingered too long, a memory held onto too tightly. But systems like this do not need to crush resistance all at once. They only need to outlast it, and eventually it fades, not because it is forgotten, but because it becomes too exhausting to carry. The body adapts before the mind accepts. Fatigue becomes normal. Silence becomes safer than expression. And survival begins to replace everything else. Some tried to hold on to pieces of themselves, small fragments, a thought no one could take, a memory no one could reach. But even those became harder to protect, because when everything around you is designed to take, holding on begins to feel like resistance against the air itself. There were no private moments, no spaces untouched by observation. Even solitude was structured, controlled, allowed only when it served the system, and without privacy. The self begins to dissolve in slow motion, not through violence alone, but through constant exposure, constant instruction, constant reduction. The hardest part was not the work itself. It was the absence of choice, the removal of why from every action. Because when meaning disappears, effort becomes something else, something mechanical, something detached, and slowly, even pain stops feeling like something that belongs to you. It becomes background, part of the environment, like sound, like air. And still, the world outside continued, uninterrupted, unbothered, as if none of this required acknowledgement, as if distance made it acceptable. That silence, the silence of the outside world, was sometimes heavier than anything within, because it confirmed what was already feared. This was not hidden. This was ignored, and being ignored is a different kind of disappearance, not sudden, not violent, but slow enough to feel like it was your own fault for fading. And so they continued, not because they believed things would change, but because stopping was no longer something they could afford to imagine. When night came, the world did not become softer. It became quieter in a way that felt intentional, as if even sound itself had learned what not to do. The days had structure. Even in suffering, there was movement, instruction, repetition. But the nights were different, less predictable, less visible, and that made them harder to endure, because what cannot be seen often feels like it can happen without limits. The women learned quickly that silence at night carried its own rules. Not spoken, but understood. Stay still. Stay small. Do not draw attention. Do not create reason, because attention was never neutral here. It always meant consequence. In the dark, imagination became a kind of torment, not because of what was happening in the moment, but because of what might happen next. Fear did not arrive loudly. It built itself slowly, in waiting, in listening, in the space between sounds that should not exist. Some nights passed without incident. Others did not. But even on the nights when nothing visible occurred, nothing ever truly felt safe, because control here was not only physical, it was psychological. It taught the mind to anticipate danger even when none was present, to remain tense even in stillness, to never fully rest. And over time, that becomes its own kind of exhaustion, the kind that sleep cannot repair. In those hours, thoughts often turned inward, to names that were no longer spoken, to voices that no longer responded, to versions of life that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Memory became both refuge and pain, something to hold on to, and something that hurt to hold. Some tried to protect each other in small ways. A shift in position, a subtle presence nearby, the unspoken reassurance that someone else was still there, still aware, still human. But even connection had limits in places designed to fragment it. And when words were dangerous, even comfort had to become silent. What remained was endurance, not hope, not certainty, just the ability to continue through something that offered no explanation for why it existed. And perhaps the most devastating realization of all was this: the world beyond this silence did not need to intervene to continue existing. It only needed to remain unaware or willing to look away. And night after night, that is exactly what it did. Even in a place built to erase them, something remained, not loud, not visible, but still there. At first, it showed itself in the smallest ways, a glance held for a second longer than allowed, a hand briefly steadying another when no one was watching, a shared breath in moments where words were impossible. None of it changed the system. None of it stopped what was happening. But it proved something important. They were still aware, still present, still human, and in a place designed to strip that away. Even awareness becomes resistance. There were moments when rules were followed perfectly, not out of acceptance, but calculation. Survival sometimes requires appearing unchanged on the surface, while everything underneath refuses to disappear. Some learned how to protect fragments of themselves, a memory repeated quietly in the mind, a name never spoken aloud, but never forgotten, a moment from before everything changed, held onto like something fragile and sacred, because forgetting would make it easier for the system to win. And so they didn't forget, even when it hurt, even when remembering felt heavier than silence. They also learned each other, not in the way life once allowed, but in a deeper, quieter understanding. A shared language without sound, a recognition that did not need permission. In a world that constantly separated them, connection became something almost invisible, but real. And that was enough. Not enough to escape, not enough to undo what had been done, but enough to keep something inside from fully breaking. Because breaking is not always loud. Sometimes it is just the moment a person stops remembering who they were, and they refuse that moment, even when everything around them pushed toward it. Even when days, blurred and fatigue deepened and silence pressed harder than words ever could, something inside remained unyielding, not strong in the way stories like to celebrate, but strong in a quieter, more difficult way, the kind of strength that does not end suffering, but survives it. And in places like this, survival itself becomes a form of defiance, not against a person, not against a moment, but against erasure, against being reduced to nothing more than what was taken from them. And so they continued, not because they were allowed to, but because something inside them still refused to stop. In the end, nothing ended the way history likes to tell it. There was no single moment of rescue, no clear line between suffering and freedom, no clean resolution that made everything make sense. Life simply continued, but not unchanged. Because even in systems designed to erase people completely, traces remain. Not in records, not in official accounts, but in memory, in silence, in the spaces where words were never allowed to fully form. Years passed in the way years always do, quietly, without asking permission. And slowly, the world outside began to shift. Not because it chose to remember, but because time made forgetting harder to maintain. Fragments of truth began to surface. A story here, a testimony there, pieces that did not fit neatly into the version of history that had been preserved. And with every fragment that emerged, the silence that once protected the system began to weaken. But even then, what happened was not fully acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require something uncomfortable: accountability. And accountability is often the last thing a system is willing to give. So instead, the stories were softened, rewritten, reduced, made easier to digest, easier to ignore. But not everyone accepted that version. Some memories refused to fade. Some voices, even after everything, could still be felt in the spaces between official silence. Not loud, not always visible, but persistent. And that persistence matters. Because erasure only works when nothing remains to challenge it. And something remained, always. This is not just a story about what was done to them. It is a story about what the world allowed to happen while pretending not to see. And that is a different kind of truth, one that cannot be neatly closed or comfortably forgotten. Because the most dangerous stories are not the ones that are told. They are the ones that were never meant to survive long enough to be heard. And yet, somehow, they did.